Great. My name is Lisa Hasselman, and I partnered with the Heritage Museum to put together a presentation for the community on the Fujioka family and their historic farming on Vashon Island. So, just for perspective, since time immemorial, Vashon, First Peoples, the Shwabopsh, lived and foraged on the island. And there's some evidence that there was presence on this northern area of the island. We are, for those familiar with Vashon, we're kind of at the neck, the high plateau at the northern skinny end of Vashon. There was evidence of a camp on the coast for indigenous people, but we have not found anything of significance here on the property. So, just for perspective, when the first member of the Fujioka family to arrive on Vashon was Sadaji Fujioka in the early 1900s. Vashon Island in the early 1900s had a drastic reduction in the Shwabopsh population. Logging and the resultant reduction in wildlife was quite drastic. A ledger from the Port Blakely Mill Company that owned what would become the Fujioka Farm said that the land had been logged barren. The industries on the island were steamships, sawmills, greenhouses, farms, brickmaking, and gravel mining. Japanese immigration. Japan had underwent a political revolution in the mid-1800s, moving from an isolationist feudal regime to an internationally focused society. And immigration to the United States, especially Hawaii and the West Coast, began. However, in 1882, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, and the 1924 Asian Exclusion Act barred additional immigration to the U.S. and declared Asians ineligible for citizenship. Without citizenship, they could not own land. There was also a gentleman's agreement of 1907-1908, where no more Japanese laborers could immigrate, but their wives, children, and parents of current immigrants could enter the U.S. So this is kind of the framework in which the Fujiokas arrived. Sadaji Fujioka arrived in the early 1900s. We think he made it to Vashon in 1907, just before the gentleman's agreement. And then his wife, Tsune Fujioka, came in 1910. However, there were legal barriers that prevented land ownership for these immigrant families. Sadaji Fujioka came from Kumamoto, Japan. Many of the Japanese on Vashon also came from Kumamoto. According to a 1900 census, he was in Fairhaven City, Washington, just south of Bellingham. We have this amazing document. We're been very lucky that the Fujioka family saved a lot of documentation about the family's history on the island. And they completed this form before they were incarcerated during World War II that lists the different jobs that Sadaji Fujioka worked prior to making it to Vashon, including logging, gardening, cannery hand, and farming. When we first find the Fujiokas on Vashon, they are down by the Beale greenhouses, the Harrington Beale greenhouses, which was an active greenhouse business in the early 1900s, and he may have worked for them. His wife came. The 1910 census says he was fruit farming as a solo head of household, however, and may have owned his own, or not owned, but leased his own farming operation. He could not own land because of those legal barriers. His wife came over from Kumamoto, Japan in 1910, and a history written by their eldest daughter, Martha, later described, Mom's friends were envious of her to go to a country with mountains of wealth. Her father cautioned her there was no such place. Her new life began on Vashon Island farming. It was not mountains of wealth, but mountains of hard work. In the 1920 census, we find the Fujiokas with now 3 sons, Teisho, Yukio, and Hatsuguri, still mid-island. In 1930, according to their daughter Martha's history, they had moved to the Landy farm, which is farther north, just south of the property that we now own, and the historic Fujioka farm. In the Landy farm, I talked to the current owners, and they remember some old structures, sheds, where a number of Japanese families lived around 1930. And one of the Fujioka daughters was actually born on that property. And Martha describes, I can remember living on the Landy's place in the 30s, where our close neighbors were the Otsukas and the Sakais. I can remember Otsudas raising string peas. Susie was born while living at this place. We had no electricity, so used those kerosene lanterns with mantles. We raised strawberries, but eventually moved from this place because the land was poor and not producing. So in 1930, they moved to the property that we currently farm. However, their eldest son was still too young to purchase the property, and so they were leasing it. And Martha describes it as, our new home and place was 5 acres. This property is actually 24 acres, but the northern area where we farm and what was cleared by 36 is a kind of 5-acre northern part. Had a large house with no electricity or running water. Dad dug a well, which still remains. This is the hand-dug well that Sadaji Fujioka dug. It's got a concrete square block on top, but about 8 feet down. It's just about a 4.5-foot wide diameter tunnel, 25 feet into the ground.
Wow.
And it's always had water in it. Even the driest part of this year, it had about 8 feet of water in it. So there was plenty of water. The place was rented under proxy since Teisho was still underage. The entire acreage was put in strawberries. The virgin soil produced tons of berries. When Mrs. Dernis and brother, Mr. Matheson, saw this, they bought the land. Around 1934, the lease ran out, and the Dernises refused to rent, so we were again forced to move, this time 5 miles away, to the Dowling and Robertson ranches. And there's this beautiful photograph of the Fujioka family in 32 in front of a structure that still exists on the farm while they were leasing the property. This is the Fujioka, the cabin. It was actually built in 1914 by a Norwegian gold miner, John Hansen, who owned the property, and it was up by the road. And it was up by the road when the Fujioka family rented it from 30 to 34. And we have that great picture of the family in front of this residence. It was moved to this current location in the 40s by Ed Matheson, and he had put a foundation under it, and we believe he intended to turn it back into a residence, but he ended up getting married and moving off island and leaving it in kind of this semi-rebuilt state. And the Fujiokas, when they purchased the property in 51, just used it for storage. They never lived in it again. They lived in the little white house. And we plan, the foundation is crumbling, so it needs a new foundation. It needs to be lifted. So the plan is to move it to the end of this pathway, so it kind of visually, you walk upon the house and put it on a new foundation and restore it to a residence as part of the landmark.
You put the roof on to save it?
We put the roof on before realizing it had historical significance to save it, yes, because it had layers of decomposing tarps on it that would blow away and big holes. So we put a roof on it hoping that we'd discover some interesting historical significance. And not only was it the home prior to World War II of the Fujioka family, but it was it's a architectural type. It's called vertical plank architecture, which was like a poor man's temporary construction type that is rare to be found on the West Coast and to survive. And it's really hard to identify because it's an internal structural thing, so you can't tell once it's been cladded. So we were so excited. We had King County landmarks out, staff out, and I was standing in the plank house, or we now call it the plank house, this cabin with Sarah Steen, and she says, "I have chills." And I'm like, "Why?" And she's like, this is a plank house. And so there's interesting architectural value as well as the cultural history with the Fujioka family. So, which is a big part of why we're trying to preserve the cabin, although we haven't met with King County permits yet about our plans. So we'll see how that goes.
It'll take another 10 years.
Exactly. So when they moved from our property, they went back mid-island and they leased two places. One is the Dowling Ranch, and we actually have the leases where they were renting, thanks to the family's record keeping. Since there was no house on this place, though, Dad built one. 4 rooms upstairs and a pantry. Mealtime was the 8 of us, sat at the table on benches and stools and enjoyed our meals together. We ate lots of sukiyaki made with pot roast. We hardly could afford steaks, but ate a lot of seafood. Fresh milk was delivered to the door. It was pasteurized, but had a lot of cream at the top. In the 1930s, there were no tractors and all plowing. Disking and harrowing was done by horse. We had a very good and gentle horse, Nellie. She played such a big part in our life. We had strawberries and loganberries, half and half. All were hand planted. We worked so hard and shared whatever chore had to be done. Perhaps that is why we prospered. And they have some beautiful pictures from that time on the farm on Dowling Place and the Robertson ranches. The Fujioka family was very engaged in the community. Yukio and Teisho were given attendance awards. Their brother George was valedictorian of his class. And Sadaji Fujioka was one of the founding members of the Vashon Japanese Association. And then World War II. In 1942, the Fujiokas were mid-island. The Fujiokas and other Japanese American families destroyed heirlooms that would link them to Japan, so they lost many of their treasures and records that went back to their history in Japan at this time. Martha Nakamoto would later write, "Even though we realized we were going to be placed in concentration camps, we were ordered to keep the farms productive. To abandon it was considered sabotage, so we complied and worked hard to show our cooperation and loyalty. Our strawberries and loganberries were in full bloom when the order came to move." And on May 16th, 1942, Japanese families on Vashon, reported to Ober, were driven in army trucks to the Heights dock and ferried to Seattle, then transported by trains with blacked out windows. Prior to this happening, the Fujiokas had contracted with a neighbor, and we have this contract. It's quite extraordinary. A.L. Datton was a friend and neighbor of the family, and they had contracted with him to take care of their leases at the Dowling and Robertson ranches if they were in fact incarcerated. The agreement was to be terminated if Teisho Fujioka did not have to go into effect. They were transferred to the Pinedale Assembly Center. Martha describes Fresno was very hot and dusty. Construction was still going on, making ready for other occupancy. Our new home was a black tar paper barrack with rooms separated by single walls. Beds were Army-issued steel cots. Some had cotton mattresses or bags filled with straw. Since the room was open, we hung blankets for privacy. Restrooms and showers were community style with no privacy whatsoever. Food was served cafeteria style, and we sat at tables whenever there were open seats. Family was separated since we ate at different times. One of the biggest complaints in camp living was the breakup of the families. And when we purchased this property from Martha and Susie, the youngest daughters, and had talked to them a bit about their time in the camps, they talked about how poor the food was and how difficult that was, eating out of a lot of canned food that wasn't something they had previously eaten. They were moved to Tule Lake from 42 to 43, and then again to Hart Mountain in Wyoming. Teisho Fujioka, the eldest son, who was a carpenter as well as a farmer, made a sign that said Fujioka, that they hung outside their tar paper barracks, which I thought was a really beautiful individualization, still having pride in their home space in these kind of barracks made to just make everybody look the same. It was very hot and dusty in the summer and cold with snow in the winter. I believe that the government placed us in the worst environment, so desolate. Martha Fujioka, the oldest daughter, had her son Dennis in June of 1944 in the Tule Lake camp. They had their, after their internment in the camps, or their incarceration, the family split up. Some of the older children left earlier for jobs in Chicago and Minnesota. Martha, who had married Kei Nakamoto and had a child, moved with him to their family's farm in Oregon. And the Fujiokas, Sadaje and Sune, and the eldest son, Teisho, and the youngest daughter, Susie, returned to Vashon. They temporarily stayed with their friend Datton, Mr. Datton. It was the start of a new life, says Martha. He rented ground on Kearney's place, also Mid-Island, and built a house there, another house that Sadaji had to build. They started farming, but literally from scratch. Ironic that once they had a thriving farm and now were reduced to start again. They leased the Kearney place from 46 to 52 and planted strawberries, 6 acres altogether. They also leased the Robinson place to the Beale Road, where they planted 3 acres of loganberries and 1 acre of strawberries. And these kind of key pieces of information, tracking just how many times the Fujioka family had moved, we found in the archives in the research room of the Heritage Museum. In 76, Ernest had interviewed Teisho Fujioka, and we hadn't kind of been able to trace where they were farming during this time, and it was in that community history that we found those key pieces of information. In 1951, the Fujioka family, Teisho, was able to purchase the property where we now farm, and which is now the King County landmark, Fujioka Farm. And right away, once they finally were able to start putting roots down and not have to worry about moving in 5 years, they remodeled one of the houses, they dug a large irrigation pond, they cleared more land to farm. They were so successful, they purchased a 1955 Dodge 1-ton truck, which Teisho took such good care of that it is back at the farm now and still running beautifully. He was awarded He won 2 awards for being members of the 5-Ton Club by Washington State, and that is farmers who were growing an average of more than 5 tons per acres of strawberries, and there were only 6 of them in Washington State in those years, 1955 and 1956, when he won. Sadaji and Suni Fujioka stayed on this property as they aged with Teisho. They hosted a holiday celebration every year on Vashon and were joined by many of their children, which had dispersed after the incarceration. They lived on Vashon until they passed away in 1967 and 68, respectively. Teisho, many knew him as Tash Fujioka, continued to farm this property until the early 70s, then worked for the Vashon Post Office, where he planted and tended to roses outside that many people enjoyed. He joined the civil service, where he and friend Reed Fitzpatrick watched Mount St. Helens erupt from a boat on the Sound. He kept his 1955 truck and maintained it meticulously. His sisters Mary and Susie would visit every week from Bainbridge to help him with cooking and laundry, and he passed in February of 2010. Since then, descendants of the Fujioka family have been generous enough to visit and share their story with us, multiple documents, and with the Heritage Museum. In 2018, I went with Bruce Hallman and others from the museum to interview Martha and her son, Stephen Nakamoto. And they again shared many pictures of the family. At that time, that is when we got this picture. And we didn't know, this building looks much different now. And the picture we received from Martha was kind of a cropped version of it. And her great-nephew sent me this broader version a few weeks later by email. And we were like, that looks like the cabin. And we finally started piecing together their story of all of their frequent moves prior to being able to put down roots at this property. We are still harvesting lasting gifts from the Fujioka family. There is still a few patches of fuki, which is a traditional Japanese vegetable, but they planted near the irrigation pond, which is now in the forest. And we harvest it in the spring and sell it at the farmer's market. We're still harvesting apples planted by the Fujiokas. We're tremendously grateful for all of the rock removal. The Vashon till soils are notoriously filled with a lot of those glacial rocks. And the Fujiokas, we have a large rock pile in the forest where clearly right on the edge of where the strawberry field was, where they dumped a large amount of rocks from the soil. And we're very grateful that they kept the property together so that we've been able to restore it mostly to native evergreen forest. And we are, one of the most recent developments is the family, or Bruce Hallman, had met with a classic truck restorer who was visiting the island, saying that he had this truck and he believed it had originated on Vashon or spent time here, and they traced it to the Fujioka family, and it was Teisho's truck, which had been sold right after he passed. And Bruce told him, I know that you're very connected to this truck now, but if you ever do plan on selling it, we would love to have it back on Vashon. And that truck restorer passed away unexpectedly, and his widow, he had told his widow that he did want the truck to eventually make it back to Vashon, and we started talking to Bruce and the Fujioka family, and after figuring it out, the truck was returned to the farm in 2024, thanks to the generous donation of the Fujioka family's descendants. so that it could return here, and we now use it to go to the farmers market and drive in some of the community parades, and received for culture funding to get signs that show Fujioka, Teisho Fujioka, with him and his original truck purchase in 1954, which is just a very cool circle returning back. So thank you very much, and thank you to the Vashon Heritage Museum for supporting this type of community history